Hello everyone, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Rosh Hashanah and specifically Hilchos Shofar. And we'll be learning today, Mirz Hashem, Daf Samach Aleph Amid Aleph. However, we pick up on Samach Amid Beis in Siman Tov Kuf Pei Vav in the midst of Sif Tes Zayin. So, at the outset of Sif Tes Zayin, the Mechaber brought down the words of a Brisa in Masechus Rosh Hashanah on Chav Zayin Amid Beis. Let's just read through the first phrase, the first halachah of the Brisa at the beginning of Sif Tes Zayin. The Mechaber says here, Tzipohu zahav b'mkoim hanakas peh. If you plated the shofar with gold at the place where you place your lips, your mouth, pasul, then the shofar is pasul. However, shaloi b'mkoim hanakas peh, if you plate it with gold not at the place where you place your mouth, kosher, then it's kosher. Now, if you skip the next few words, the next phrases in the Mechaber, we go to the second line of Sif Tes Zayin, where the Mechaber brings down two opinions on how to explain this halacha, and we learned the first one yesterday, Friday, Erev Shabbos, and I'm just going to say it outside. But first, let's read the two opinions in the Mechaber. The first opinion is, Yesh Mefarshim, there are those that explain, and this is the sheet of the Ran, Mekayim Hanachas Peh. What does it mean, the place where you place your mouth? Hainu Oivi HaShofar, that means the thickness of the shofar, and as I explained on Erev Shabbos, it means the cross section, the thickness, the face of the mouthpiece of the shofar. Litzad Penimi, the inside of the face. It doesn't mean the inside of the shofar. It means the face of the shofar has one side that goes towards the inside and one side that goes towards the outside. So it's kind of like what we're doing is we're dividing the thickness of the face of the shofar into two sections, an inner section and an outer section. So if you plate the inner section, right, so the Mechaber says, that's the inner section, is called the place that you put your mouth, and if you put gold there, it would be pasul. And the outer edge of that face, so again, not on the outside of the shofar, on the face, on the thickness of the shofar, but the outer part of it, that is called and if you would put gold over there, it would be kosher. And we learned in the Mishnah Berurah, and I used the opposite side of my shofar just for illustration purposes, because here you could see so clearly what it is that I'm speaking about when I talk about the thickness of the shofar. So again, the Brisa says, if you plated the mouthpiece of the shofar with gold, it depends precisely where you put the gold. If you put the gold where you place your lips, then it's pasul. According to the Ran, what that means is we take the thickness of the face of the mouthpiece and we divide it into two sections. We divide it into an inner section, that's the section going towards the inside of the shofar, and into an outer section, the thickness of the shofar going towards the outside of the shofar. If you coat the inner section of the thickness of the mouthpiece with gold, then the Brisa says it's pasul. And the reason for the pasul is because when you blow the shofar, the air is going to travel through, it's going to pass through that area that you coated with gold. And now when you hear the sound of the shofar, you're not hearing just the sound of the shofar, you're hearing the shofar and davar acher. You're hearing the shofar and gold, and therefore it's pasul. But if you coat the outer edge of the thickness of the face of the mouthpiece, then the air doesn't pass through over there. Your lips are covering that area, and therefore that is going to be kosher. Now, why don't you look at that gold as being included in the next halachah of the Brisa? The next of the halachah of the Brisa is if you coat the outside of the shofar with gold, so then it depends. If it changes the sound of the shofar, then it's pasul. If it doesn't change the sound of the shofar, then it's kosher. So how could the Brisa say that if you coat the outer edge of the mouthpiece with gold, it's kosher? Why don't we say it depends? If it changes the coil, then it's pasul. The same way if you put gold on the outside of the shofar, if it changes the coil, it's pasul. So on that, the Mishnah Berurah explained that the Ran says a little bit of gold on that outer edge of the surface of the cross section, the thickness of the shofar, that is certainly not going to change the coil of the shofar, and therefore the Brisa could just say straight out, any gold over there is kosher. Any gold over there would not cause a pasul. So very simply put, we had the Brisa. Brisa talks about coating the mouthpiece of the shofar. It says it depends. If you do the inner edge of the thickness, then it's pasul because you're blowing through that gold area. If you do the outer section of the thickness of the mouthpiece, then it's kosher, and it's not a problem of tzipozav mibachutz, of plating the outside of the shofar with gold, because that little bit of gold is certainly not going to change the coil of the shofar. That was the opinion of the Ran. Now we pick up 5 lines off the bottom on Samach Amud Beis, with the second opinion brought down over here, and this is the opinion of the Rosh, who understands this halachah of the Brisa somewhat differently. Says the Mechaber, V'yesh b'farshim, there are those who explain this halachah of the Brisa differently, this sheet of the Rosh, and the Rosh learns as follows: the avyoy b'makom hakotzer hu mikayim hanachas hapeh. According to the Rosh, the entire thickness of the face of the mouthpiece is all called mikayim hanachas hapeh. The Ran divided the thickness into two sections, an outer section and an inner section. The Rosh says no. The entire thickness, the entire face of the mouthpiece is called mikayim hanachas hapeh. And if you put gold anywhere on the thickness of that mouthpiece, the shofar is pasul. V'shaloi b'mikayim hanachas hapeh, and when the Brisa says that if you put gold, shaloi b'mikayim hanachas hapeh, then it's kosher, it doesn't mean on the thickness of the mouthpiece at all. It means, and I'm going to tell you what it means outside before I read the words of the Mechaber, because the Mishnah Berurah is actually going to tell us that the words of the Mechaber are slightly misleading. According to the Rosh, Mekayim hanachas hapeh is the entire thickness of the face of the mouthpiece. That's Mekayim hanachas hapeh, and any gold over there renders the shofar pasul. Shaloi b'mekayim hanachas hapeh means on the outside of the shofar, right over here, right next to, I'm blocking with my fingers, right here, right next to the mouthpiece, but on the outside of the shofar. Now, you'll say, but if it's, again, the same question we asked on the Ran, if you're talking about gold on the outside of the shofar, why isn't that included in the Brisa's next halachah, where the Brisa says if you put gold on the outside of the shofar, it depends on whether or not it changes the coil. If it changes the coil, it's pasul. If it doesn't change the coil, it's kosher. And the Rosh is going to answer in the same way that the Ran did. The Rosh says, if you put gold on the face of the mouthpiece anywhere, that's called mekayim hanachas hapeh, that's pasul. If you put gold right next to the mouthpiece on the outside of the shofar, over there it's kosher, because a little bit of gold on the outside of the shofar right next to the mouthpiece is certainly not going to change the coil, and therefore that's kosher. Then the next halachah of the Brisa is talking about gold anywhere else on the outside of the shofar, from beginning with right after the first mashahu next to the mouthpiece. The first mashahu next to the mouthpiece, that's considered mekayim, that's shaloi b'mekayim hanachas hapeh. That's called putting gold by the mouthpiece, not where you place your lips, and that's kosher. And we don't have to worry about it changing the coil, because that little bit of gold is certainly not going to change the coil. And from there to the end of the shofar, if you put gold anywhere else on the outside of the shofar, that's the second halachah of the Brisa. If it changes the coil, it's pasul. If it doesn't change the gold, it's kosher. So to put it very succinctly, the difference between the Rosh and the Ran, according to the Ran, when the Brisa talks about mekayim hanachas hapeh and shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, both are on the face of the mouthpiece, on the thickness of the shofar. Mekayim anachas hapeh is the thickness that's right next to the inside. Over there, it's pasul. Shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh is on the thickness of the face, right next to the outside. But it's not on the outside, it's on the face. Over there, it's kosher. And that has a different din than on the outside of the shofar. On the outside of the shofar, according to the Ran, even if it's right next to the mouthpiece, right here, that would depend. If it changes the koil, it's pasul. If it doesn't change the koil, it's kosher. That's the sheet of the Ran. According to the Rosh, the entire thickness of the face of the mouthpiece has the same din. That's all called b'mkayim anachas hapeh, and any gold over there, or any other material, non-shofar material, or shofar material, renders the shofar pasul. Immediately next to the mouthpiece on the outside of the shofar, that's called shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, and if you put gold or some other material over there, it's kosher. The Brisa says gold on the outside of the shofar depends on whether or not it changes the koil, not immediately next to the mouthpiece. Immediately next to the mouthpiece, that tiny area is definitely not going to change the koil of the shofar, and therefore the Brisa says that is kosher. Anywhere else on the outside of the shofar, from right next to the mouthpiece all the way through to the wide end, that's the halachah of the Brisa. If it changes the koil, it's pasul. If it doesn't change the koil, it's kosher. That's the explanation of the Rosh. But now when we read the Mechaber on the inside, you'll see why the Mishnah Berurah says that the wording of the Mechaber is slightly imprecise and a little bit misleading. Let's read it inside. So again, this is the second opinion, this is the sheet of the Rosh. The Yesh Befarshim, there are those who explain the Avyai B'Makayim HaKotzer, the thickness of the shofar on the short end, on the small end of the shofar, by the mouthpiece, that entire thickness, whom Mekayim Anachas Hapeh, that's what the Brisa refers to as Mekayim Anachas Hapeh, and any gold over there on the entire face, whether towards the inside or towards the outside, renders the shofar pasul. V'shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, and when the Brisa speaks about shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, that means right next to the mouthpiece on the outside. But look at the way the Mechaber writes it. Hainu, kol oirech ha-shofar, that means the entire length of the shofar, mitzad ha-kotzer, from the small end, ad tzad ha-rochav, until the wide end. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber clearly doesn't mean what he just wrote. He doesn't mean that shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, that when the Brisa says that shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, if you put the zahav, shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, the shofar is kosher, and that means all the way from here, all the way to here. That's simply not true. Because the Brisa says if you put gold on the outside of the shofar, it depends if it changes the koil or not. What the Mechaber means is the sheet of the Rosh, which is shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, means on the outside of the shofar, right next to the mouthpiece, but the halachah of the outside of the shofar is divided into two pieces. Right next to the mouthpiece, that is considered shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, and that's kosher. And that's always kosher, because that little bit of gold is not going to change the koil. Anywhere else, it depends whether it changes the koil. Why does the Mechaber write it that way? Why does the Mechaber write v'shaloi b'mkayim hanachas hapeh hainu kol oirech ha-shofar? I believe the reason the Mechaber writes it that way is because really that is true. What the Mechaber is telling you is the shita of the Rosh is, in essence, that there's a difference between the thickness of the mouthpiece and the outside. The thickness of the mouthpiece, that's Mekayim Hanachas Hapeh, and any gold over there renders the shofar pasul. The outside of the shofar, the entire outside of the shofar, from the tip over here all the way to here, essentially has the same din. If it changes the koil, it pasuls the shofar. If it doesn't change the koil, it does not pasul the shofar. But the Rosh says, immediately next to the mouthpiece is kosher. Why? Not because it is a different din than the outside of the shofar. It's just that a little bit of gold immediately next to the mouthpiece will not change the koil. and therefore that's kosher. So that's why the Brisa says, if you put gold by the mouthpiece, bimkoyim anachas hapeh, it's pasul. Shaloi bimkoyim anachas hapeh, right here on the outside, it's kosher, because right over there won't change the coil. Gold anywhere else on the outside of the shofar, if it changes the coil, it's pasul. The truth is, gold right next to the mouthpiece on the outside of the shofar would also pasul the shofar if it changes the coil, but it doesn't. So that's why you could put gold, according to the Rush, right next to the mouthpiece. Okay, a little bit complicated. I hope we get all that. I'm sure having the shofar handy helps. But now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah inside. So we left off in the Mishnah Berurah on Friday. We were in Ois Katan Samach Tes, in the middle of Ois Katan Samach Tes, by the words Vala Pirish Hasheni, which in my Mishnah Berurah are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines off of the bottom. Vala Pirish Hasheni, according to the second explanation, which is the Shita of the Rush. What does it mean, Bimkoim anachas hapeh and Shaloi Bimkoim anachas hapeh? Kol oisai akotze shelamayla, the entire end of the shofar. Now let's remember, we always call this part of the shofar lamayla, on top, even though we tend to think of the shofar like this, and that's why we would call this the top of the shofar. In halachah, we call this the top of the shofar and this the bottom of the shofar. So when we say that we're going lamayla, we mean going this way. When we say that we're going lamata, we mean this way. So, says the Mishnah Berurah, Kol oisai akotze shelamayla, all of the top edge of the shofar, here, masha machnis l'soich piv, the mouthpiece that you put against your mouth, hakoil nikra mekayim anachas hapeh. According to the Rush, that entire face, the entire thickness, is called mekayim anachas hapeh, and if you put gold there, the shofar is pasul. V'shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, and when the Brisa says shaloi b'mkayim anachas hapeh, hainu mashehu samuch la'oisai makam mibachutz. That's a tiny bit of the shofar next to the mouthpiece on the outside, not on the face, on the outside of the shofar. Usvirale, and the Rush holds, the machmas oisei mashehu, from a drop of gold on the outside of the shofar, right next to the mouthpiece, gam kein ein derech hakoil lehishtanos, that is not going to change the coil of the shofar, af shehu ala doifen mibachutz, even though it's on the outer wall of the shofar. Ulekach sasma habraisa de kosher, and that's why the Brisa was able to write, if you put zav shaloi bimkoim anachas hapeh, meaning over here it's kosher, even though that essentially has the same din as gold on the rest of the outside of the shofar. If it changes the coil, it's pasul. If it doesn't change the coil, it's kosher. But over here, it's not going to change the coil, and therefore the Brisa just wrote stam shaloi bimkoim anachas hapeh, it's kosher. Umin oisai makom ulamata, and from here, from right next to the mouthpiece, ulamata, and downward towards the wide end of the shofar, mikri tzipos of mibachutz. That's referred to by the Brisa as plating the shofar with gold on the outside. V'tolui be'im nishtan hakoil, and the halachah over there is dependent on whether or not it changes the coil. If it changes the coil, it's pasul. If it doesn't change the coil, it's kosher. V'im tzipos of mibifnim, and if you coat the shofar with gold on the inside, b'chol gavni pasul, then the shofar is always going to be pasul, mishum shu tekei abazav, because then you're not blowing shofar, then you're blowing gold, because the sound chamber of the shofar is lined with gold. So you're not hearing the sound of the shofar, you're hearing the sound of the gold. Ois kat the ayin aleph, hainu kol oirech ha-shofar. Over here the Mishnah Berurah is going to say what I told you, that the Chavetz Chaim says that the wording of the Mechaber is a little bit misleading. When the Mechaber says, v'shaloi b'mkoim anachas hapeh, hainu kol oirech ha-shofar, mitzad ha-kotzer atzad ha-rochav. The Mechaber sounds like the entire outer surface of the shofar, from the tip of the mouthpiece all the way to the wide end, has the same din. According to the Rush, that's not really true. The mashahu on the outside of the shofar, right next to the mouthpiece, over there, if you put gold, the shofar is kosher, because we assume it doesn't change the gold, the coil, a little bit of gold over there. The rest of the shofar, from that first mashu till the end, has a different din. Over there, if you put gold, we have to see if it changes the coil or not. Ois Kot Nayin Aleph, where the Chavetz Chaim explains this. HaMechaber kitzer bazeh. The Mechaber was very succinct. He was mekatzer. He wrote his wording in a short way, and he didn't explain this fully. Mashma, because from the wording of the Mechaber, it sounds like the chol oirich, that the entire length of the shofar on its outer surface, chadadina islay, it all has one din, the kosher im tzipozav, and it's kosher if you plate it with gold, if it doesn't change the coil. Ube'emez ze'enoi, that's not really true. The rak mashu harishain, it's only that first mashahu of the outer surface of the shofar that's right next to the mouthpiece, that's right next to the thickness of the face of the mouthpiece, kosher. Over there, if you put gold, at that first mashahu, right over here, if you put gold over there on the outside of the shofar, that's when the Brisa says that flat out it's kosher. But from there all the way till the wide end of the shofar, im tzipo, if you played it with gold, talui, it's dependent, if that's going to change the coil of the shofar. Okay, so with that we concluded a very complicated Sif Tez Zayin, and now we go to Sif Yud Zayin. Wow, I can't believe we're already 20 minutes into the shir. We're going to have to see how far we get. I thought we were going to get further. All right. Sif Yud Zayin. We have a few easy sifim now, so let's see. Sif Yud Zayin. Hamitzayrim b'shofar tzurais b'minei tzivonim kedei l'na'osai. People who decorate the shofar with tzurais, with different designs, b'minei tzivonim, with different types of dyes or different types of colored fabrics, kedei l'na'osai, in order to beautify the shofar, la yafa heim oisim, it's not right what they are doing. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut 9 bays. La yafa heim oisim. Why? Because what you're doing is you're putting something, some foreign substance, on the exterior of the shofar. And we just learned in Sif Tez Zayin, if you put something on the exterior of the shofar, if it changes the coil of the shofar, it pasuls the shofar. So says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton ayin bays, the lepa'amim mishtana hakoil ma'at. Sometimes by putting different types of decorations on the exterior of the shofar, you could somewhat change the coil of the shofar, in which case the shofar is pasul. So the lepa'amim mishtana hakoil ma'at b'shvil zeh. Now let's go back to the Shulchan Aruch, to the words of the Ramah. Aval, however, muter lachikoik b'shofar atzmai tzurais, you're allowed to engrave designs into the body of the shofar itself. Tzurais kedei l'na'osai. You're allowed to make cuts. You're allowed to engrave into the shofar to beautify the shofar. You can't fill those engravings with paint or any other substance, but you could cut into the shofar to make it beautiful. Says the Chavetz Chaim, and the Ramah brought this down from the Bes Yosef. Says the Chavetz Chaim, is cut dain gimel aval mutter. That would be permissible. Why? Da'afim yishtane koiloi machmazel leslan ba. Because even if that changes the coil of the shofar, we don't care. Why? Kevet shuhu machmas atzmoi. Because you're not putting something foreign onto the shofar. The problem of putting something else onto the shofar is that now we're not hearing the coil shofar. We're hearing the coil shofar v'davar acher. We're hearing the coil of the shofar together with whatever foreign substance you put on it. But if you cut into the shofar, if you engrave the shofar, so now that's the natural coil of the shofar. Just the same way as we learned earlier, if the shofar became punctured and you didn't try to do anything to repair it, the shofar is kosher even if the puncture changed the coil of the shofar. That's the coil of this shofar. That's the coil of this shofar with a puncture. This is the coil of the shofar with engravings. That's fine. The Chavetz Chaim says this is similar to what we learned in Sif Yud Daled. In Sif Yud Daled we said if you shave down the shofar either on the inside or on the outside to make the walls of the shofar thinner, the shofar is kosher even if it changes the coil. And in Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Samach Hey, further up on Samach Hamid Beis, the Mishnah Berurah said the same thing he says here. Since the change in the sound of the shofar is not being caused by any foreign substance or any different material that was added to the shofar, the change in the coil is due to the shofar itself. You thinned out the walls of the shofar. Or in our case here, you engraved the walls of the shofar. Whatever coil this shofar makes in its present condition is kosher. Sif Yud Ches, 2 lines from the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch. Im nasan zav al uve ha-shofar b'tzad harochav. If you placed gold on the wide end of the shofar. Now specifically the Mechaber says here, he's addressing the halachah of if you placed gold on the thickness, on the face of the top of the shofar. Not on the outer wall, on the face. Im nasan zav al uve ha-shofar b'tzad harochav, hainu haisif kol shehu pasul. So what does that mean? You added on to the shofar. You extended the shofar. Now it's true if it's just a plating on that surface, it doesn't seem that you really extended the shofar. You didn't put on another piece, but even if you put on a millimeter of gold over here, right? It doesn't matter. That is adding something onto the shofar. You added onto the shofar. And pasul, that's pasul. And that's essentially the halacha that the Shulchan Aruch said on the top of Samach Hamid Beis in Sif Yod Aleph. Haisif alav kol shehu. If you added on even the most minute amount, the shofar is pasul. And let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. It's cut nine dalid. Hainu haisif. Ritzayin Lomar. What the Mechaber wants to say is upasul b'chol gavni. The shofar is pasul no matter what. Afim lo nishtana hakoil. Even if the sound of the shofar didn't change because of this little plating of gold that you put on the wide end, it doesn't matter. The air that's creating the sound travels through over there, and therefore you're hearing the coil of the shofar of a davar acher. Now, in Sharetzion, Ois Cotton Kuf Yod Aleph, the Chavetz Chaim says, over here in Sif Yud Ches, the Mechaber says, Im nasan zav al oivei ha-shofar b'tzad harochav. You put gold on the surface, on the face of the thick end. And how about if you did it on the thin end? Well, we just finished learning all of those halachas in Sif Tezayim of if you put on the thickness of the mouthpiece. So the Sharetzion just points out over here, don't think that the Mechaber in Sif Yud Ches, when he speaks about if you put gold on the thickness of the wide end, it's pasul. Don't think he's coming to exclude if you put gold on the thickness of the narrow end of the mouthpiece. That's already pasul because you're putting gold on the mouthpiece. That's pasul because of the halachos that we learned in Tezayin. Okay. Now we go to Sif Yud Tes, bottom line, Samach Hamid Beis. Says the Mechaber, Hirchik es ha-shofar. If you distanced the shofar from your lips, instead of putting it on your lips to blow shofar, you distanced it. V'nafach bay, and you blew into the shofar. V'taka bay, and you managed to get a coil. I can't get a coil. I believe the reason I can't get a coil, Shlomo Zalman seems to be much more talented than me with all of these offbeat cases. Shlomo Zalman told me that he got a trua out of 2 shofars at the same time, which is fascinating to me. I can't wait to see it. But over here, what we're talking about is you didn't put the shofar on your lips so that the shofar picks up the vibrations of your lips. You kept it off your lips and you blew into it. And you managed to get a coil out of it. The Mechaber says, pasul, that's pasul. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton ayin hey, v'nafach bay. The be'inon, why is this pasul? The be'inon, because we need sheyeh piv medubak l'shofar. Your mouth has to be touching the shofar. V'simanoi, and we have a siman, we have a hint to this in a pasuk in Hosea, where the pasuk says, El chikcha shofar. Place a shofar to your palate. So this is a siman. It's not a drasha. We're not darshaning. We're not learning the halacha out of the pasuk in Hosea, but the pasuk in Hosea is like a remez to that the shofar has to be connected physically. It has to be touching you. Oiskanayin vav v'takaboy pasul. If you did this, if you distance it from your mouth and you blew and you got a coil, it's pasul. Says the Chavetz Chaim v'yaskar v'yiska shenis kadin. You should blow over again in the proper manner by putting the shofar to your lips. Ubli bracha, but you should do it without making a bracha. Now, if you take a look in the Sharet Tzion over here on Samach Aleph Amud Aleph in Ois Cotton Kuf Yud Beis, the Chavetz Chaim brings this down from the Matei Ephraim that you should blow again, but without a bracha. V'atam, and the reason why you're not going to make a bracha when you blow the second time is mipnei she'ein din zeh borur. This halacha that the shofar has to be touching your lips is not clear. That's not a clear halacha. We don't have that as for sure halacha l'maisa, and therefore it's possible that you worry yoitza, and therefore you can't make a bracha. You blow again without a bracha. Okay, now we go to Sif Chaf. Says the Mechaber, Nasan shofar l'soich shofar. If you inserted one shofar inside another shofar, and you blew that way. So, says the Mechaber, it depends. Im hapnimi oidef alachitzain mishneit stadav. If the inner shofar extends beyond the openings of the larger shofar on both ends, so that the inner shofar protrudes, it sticks out from this end, and it also sticks out from this end, from the mouthpiece end. So, in that case, im hapnimi oidef alachitzain mishneit stadav. If the inner shofar extends beyond the walls of the outer shofar on both ends, and therefore v'nasan apnimi b'fiv, and now you're putting the inside shofar to your lips, v'takabai, and you're blowing in it. So then what are you doing? Your lips are touching the inner shofar, and at the wide end, the inner shofar extends beyond the outer walls of the outer shofar. So okay, kosher. Says the Mechaber, that's kosher. Because what are you doing? You're blowing in the inner shofar. The outer shofar is not affecting anything over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kanayin Zayin. Oidef alachitzain mishneit stadav v'nasan apnimi. Explains the Chavetz Chaim. The azam rinon, because then we say shenishma kol pnimi levad. All you heard was the sound of the inside shofar. You put the mouthpiece of the inside shofar to your lips, and the open end of the inside shofar extends beyond, above the open end of the outside shofar. So okay, so you blew in the inner shofar, and the sound emanated from the inner shofar. So you heard the sound of the inner shofar. No problem. Now let's go to the Ramah. The Ramah says, V'li nira. It appears to me. The Mechaber said that the shofar, the inner shofar, has to extend beyond the walls of the outer shofar, even at the wide end. Says the Ramah, V'li nira, it seems to me, Ta'afilu einoi boilet b'tzad harachav. Even if at the wide end, the inner shofar does not extend beyond the walls of the outer shofar. Rak shaveh l'chitzain. Even if it's exactly level with the outer shofar. So somehow the inner shofar, the mouthpiece extends from the outer shofar, so your lips are going only on the inner shofar, but the upper end of the inner shofar is exactly flush with the walls of the outer shofar. In that case, says the Ramah, it seems to him, since the mouthpiece of the inner shofar is extending beyond the outer shofar, so we know that you blew in the inner shofar, v'taka b'pnimi, yatsa, yoyotza, kein nirali. The Ramah says, so it appears to me. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cotton ayin ches. Rak shava lechitzain, as long as it's flush, as long as the wide end of the inner shofar is equal to the wide end of the outer shofar, the Ramah says that should be kosher. If the inner shofar would be even a mashahu, even a drop, shorter than the outer shofar, so that the walls of the inner shofar end before the walls of the outer shofar, and the outer shofar extends beyond the walls of the inner shofar, then lo yotza l'kulei alma. Then everybody would agree that you are not yotza. The soif, because at the end of the day, yotza hakoil min shnei shofaros. Because now the sound emanated from two shofars. You blew in the inner shofar. the sound exited the inner shofar while it's still inside the walls of the outer shofar, the air that's carrying that sound then travels through the walls of the outer shofar. Now when you finally hear the sound, you're hearing shtei shofars. You're hearing the sound of the inner shofar and the sound of the outer shofar when it exited the inner shofar and was trapped inside the chamber of the outer shofar. The Taz writes, don't think that the Ramah is arguing on the Mechaber. What did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber said, if you blew in the inside shofar, so the inside shofar extended beyond the mouthpiece of the outer shofar, and it also extended the wide end of the inner shofar, extended beyond the wide end of the outer shofar. The Mechaber said that's kosher. The Ramah says the inner shofar doesn't have to extend beyond the walls of the outer shofar. It could even be even. It could be flush with the upper walls of the outer shofar. Says the Taz, the Ramah is not arguing on the Mechaber. The Mechaber would also agree with that. Because of a Taz, the Mechaber would agree to what the Ramah says. The me'ikar din, from a strict din standpoint, im shneim shavim, it's true. If the inner shofar and the outer shofar end at the wide end exactly even, then im shneim shavim, does efsher sheyishbu kaila pnimi, the kosher. It's possible. Now I'll tell you why in a minute I'll tell you why the Chafetz Chaim quotes the Taz as saying that it's possible. Elamishum the kosher litzamtzem b'shavyam. The reason the Mechaber didn't want to write what the Ramah writes. The Ramah writes, if it's exactly even, it's kosher. The Taz says, yeah, the Mechaber would also agree that that's kosher. But the Mechaber wasn't going to write the halachah that way. You know why? Because you're going to have such a case, and you're going to look at the two shofars, and you're going to say, is it even? Is it not? Says the Chafetz Chaim, it's EF shalatamtzem. What are you going to do? You're going to get a micrometer, and you're going to measure to the nth degree to see, is it exactly even? Therefore, said the Mechaber, it has to extend. If it extends, we know it extends. If it extends, we know it's kosher. If it doesn't extend, we're getting into Iyashal Tzamtzim territory. That's too much of a gray area, and the Mechaber didn't want to write that. So again, I'm going to read the Chafetz Chaim from the beginning of Ayin Tes. Because of a Taz, the Taz says, the Gama Mechaber Moida Bazeh. The Mechaber also agrees that the me'ikar adin im shneim shavim, that really me'ikar adin, if the two shofars are exactly even, does efshe yishvu karla pnimi the kosher. You look at it and it looks like it's exactly even. Yeah, it's possible that you're only hearing the coil of the inside shofar because it's possible that they're exactly even, in which case you would be yaitza. But because it's almost impossible to be mitzamtzem, are they mamish exactly even, or is the inner one maybe a little bit shorter? That's why the Mechaber wrote that the inner one has to extend. The Mechaber wants to say, when am I going to say it's kosher? If we see that the inside one extends beyond the outside one. Now we go to the Ramah. Now we go back to the words of the Shulchan Aruch, 3 lines down from the top, right by the Ois Cut and Pay for the Mishnah Berurah. Vehu shalo yeshane koiloi b'mashu nosen b'seich achitzai. When is this halachah true? That if the inside shofar extends on both sides, it extends beyond the outer shofar, by the mouthpiece and by the top end. Somebody said that it's kosher because you're only hearing the sound of the inside shofar. When is that true? That's true if the sound of the inside shofar is not changed in any way by virtue of the fact that it's inserted within the outside shofar. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cut and Pay, V'hu shalo yeshane koiloi. This is only true if the sound of the inside shofar is not being changed because it's inside the outer shofar. Even if the inside shofar extends on both sides, so we know that you're only hearing the sound of the inside shofar, nevertheless, it's still possible that the sound of the inside shofar is being changed by the fact that it's being covered up by the outside shofar. Nimtza kol ba mikoyach shnei shofaros. And if that's true, then you're hearing the sound of two shofars. Because then the inside shofar makes one koil, and now that it's covered by the outside shofar is affecting the koil that you hear. Oh, now you have a problem of shofar echad amar achmana v'lo shtei shofaros. Now you're hearing a sound that's being created by two shofars, and that would be pasul. And now we get to the last three words of Sifchaf. V'im lav, pasul. And if not, the shofar is pasul. What does the Mechaber mean with those three words? Says the Mishnah cut in Pei Aleph, Koi aroish hasif. These three words, v'im lav pasul, go back on the beginning of Sifchaf. Or it's Tzadei Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, in the beginning of Sifchaf, the Mechaber said, if you have one shofar inserted inside another shofar, so it depends. If it extends on both sides, if the inside shofar is longer than the outside shofar, so it extends beyond the mouthpiece of the outer shofar, and it extends on the wide end beyond the walls of the outer shofar, then it's kosher. Now, says the Mechaber, v'im lav pasul. If it doesn't protrude on both ends, then it's pasul. Or if the inner shofar is not longer than the outer shofar, pasul, then the shofar is pasul. Mishum deruach piv doichek b'shnehem, because the wind generated by your blowing is going through both shofars, and you're hearing a sound generated by two shofars. Let's say, for example, if the inner shofar is shorter than the outer shofar, so that the air, the breath, emanates from the inner shofar while it's still trapped inside the walls of the outer shofar, so then the walls of the outer shofar are contributing to the sound. So then you have a problem of shofar echad amar achmana v'lo shtei shofaros. And now finally, the Chavetz Chaim ends off over here, and he says, Umikol zeh, from all of these halachos that we've been learning, that are covered by the drasha of shofar echad amar achmana v'lo shtei shofaros, anu lemedin, we could also learn the imtaka b'shnei shofaros, that if you blow two shofars at the same time, imtaka b'shnei shofaros mamish, if you put one shofar here and another shofar here and you blow, davadei lo yotza, certainly you're not yotza, because of shofar echad amar achmana v'lo shtei shofaros. Sifchaf Aleph. Shofar shel Rosh Hashanah. For the shofar that you're going to blow on Rosh Hashanah, ein mechalelin alav Yom Tov. You cannot be mechalel Yom Tov in order to have a shofar to blow on Rosh Hashanah. Afilu b'davar sheyesh by b'shum shvus. Even if the isser that you're going to be over is only an isser d'Rabbanan. So, for example, ketzad. The Mechaber himself says ketzad. What would be a case of this halacha? Haya shofar b'roisha ilon. Let's say you got to go to shul to blow shofar, and guess what? Your shofar is sitting up on the branch of a tree. You're not allowed to take something off of a tree on Yom Tov. That's an Issa D'Rabbanan. Aymei Ever Anar. Or the shofar is located on the other side of the lake, on the other side of the river. Ve'ein lo shofar elahu. And you don't have another shofar. And you want to go get it. Ein ha'olah be'ilon. You're not allowed to go climb up on the tree, because you're not allowed to climb up on a tree on Yom Tov. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's a gzeira. You're not allowed to climb up on a tree. You're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos or Yom Tov. A gzeira, we're afraid you might break off a stick off of a tree and use it as a switch to make an animal go. Ve'ein shot al pnei hamayim, and you're not allowed to go swimming in a river or in a lake on Shabbos or Yom Tov. That's a gzeira also, because you might go make a life preserver. So you're not allowed to do these things kidei lahaviyai. You wouldn't be allowed to do any of these Isurei D'Rabbanan in order to go get the shofar, so that you should be able to be Mekayim the mitzvah sasei daraisa of hearing shofar. Yehudi mutter. But to have a non-Jew do one of these things, so if the shofar is in the tree, and you want to ask a non-Jew to climb the tree to get the shofar, that would be mutter. You want to ask a non-Jew to swim across the river to go get the shofar, that would be mutter. Why? Says the Mechaber, tevi shvus to shvus. Because that would be a case of a double D'Rabbanan. That's a shvus to shvus. You are being over one Issa D'Rabbanan, which is to ask an Eino Yehudi to do malacha for you. But the malacha that the Ein Yehuda is doing is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. So it's 2 D'Rabbanans. He's doing an Issa D'Rabbanan, and you're asking him to do it as an Issa D'Rabbanan. A shvus, the shvus, b'makay mitzvah is mutter. So again, just to succinctly say what the Mechaber said, if you need a shofar, but you have to be over even only an Issa D'Rabbanan to get the shofar, you're not allowed to be Mechal Yom Tov. Even on a D'Rabbanan level, you're not allowed to be Mechal Yom Tov in order to facilitate the blowing of the shofar. Even though that's an Asay Daraisa. Still, you're not allowed to do it, and the Chavetz Chaim will explain why. But through Amira La'akum, to ask a non-Jew to do an Issa D'Rabbanan, that you are allowed to do because that would be a Shvus to Shvus b'makay mitzvah. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cut and pay beis. Ein Mechalelin, you can't be Mechal Yom Tov. Why? Mishum dechil Yom Tov ba'asei v'lois asei. Because to be Mechal Yom Tov is also because of an Isser Lav. There's a Lav that you're not allowed to do Malacha on Yom Tov, and there's also a Mitzvah Sasei. There's a Mitzvah Sasei that you're supposed to refrain from doing Malacha on Yom Tov. So you have a positive commandment, right? You have a mitzvah to refrain from doing Malacha, and you also have a Lav, you have a Lois Sasei, do not do Malacha on Yom Tov. And ein asay, and we have a rule, ein asay doicha lois asay va'asay. The mitzvah of shofar is a mitzvah asay. It's a positive commandment. Go blow shofar. Go hear the sound of the shofar. An asay is not doicha a lois asay va'asay. The shofar hu rak asay, ve'ena doicha. If you take a look at in the Sharetzion, it's cut in Kuf Tezayin. The Sharetzion actually brings down from a Ran. He says it's true. What the Ran says is true, that the asay of shofar is not doicha the lois asay va'asay of not doing malacha on Yom Tov, but in reality we don't need that reason. There's another reason why we can't do it, and that is because even though we say asay doicha lois asay, an asay is doicha a lois asay alone, but that wouldn't apply over here, because the only time we say asay doicha lois asay is when by transgressing the lois asay, at that very moment you're mekayim the asay. Then we say asay doicha lois asay. But over here that's not the case. Over here you want to be over an asay. Let's say you want to go do malacha on Yom Tov. So you want to do an Issa D'Rabbanan in order to have a shofar. Having a shofar is not a mitzvah asay. Hearing the shofar is the mitzvah asay. So you're not being mekayim the asay when you do the lois asay. So over here, the asay of shofar would not be mekayim a lois asay of malacha on Yom Tov, even without the asay. Ois Pei Gimel, says the Chavetz Chaim, mishum shvus. You're not allowed to be over even in Issa D'Rabbanan on Yom Tov in order to facilitate shofar blowing. Why? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, the Chachamim hishvu divrayim l'shel Torah, because the Chazal gave strength to their decrees and they equated it to an Issa D'Oraisa. V'he'emidu divrayim b'sheva al taisa b'mkoim asay. Over here, what are the Chachamim telling you? The Chachamim are saying you can't go swimming across the river to go get the shofar. Why? I want to go get the shofar in order to be mekayim and asay daraisa of shofar. The Chachamim tell you b'shev v'al taisa. Shev v'al taisa means sit and do nothing. Be passive. What are we telling you? We're telling you to passively not be mekayim the mitzvah asay of kol shofar. Why? Because you want to be over in Issa D'Rabbanan in order to do that. The Chachamim are mekayim divrayim. The Chazal gave strength to their decree not to go swimming on Yom Tov, even though you're going to transgress a mitzvah asay. But you're going to transgress that mitzvah asay only b'sheva al taisa, only in a passive manner. You're not going to get up and do the asay. All right, I see we're already going quite long. I was hoping we would get further today, but we're going to stop over here with Ois Cut and Pei Daled in the Mishnah Berurah. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Schos of limud HaTorah should be megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas and Fuas and Parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.